Welcome back everyone, I'm John at Questmarker, and I'm here today to talk about orcs, beards, axes, and what happens when you only half succeed at transforming a fictional book into an isometric RPG. So have you heard about the Dwarves?
Perhaps you'll manage to kill at least one of them, so as not to appear so undwarven in Varacus's eyes. Damn. Attack.
How did you manage to lose your weapon? Go and get it, and this time, hold it tight!
The Dwarves was funded via Kickstarter and created by the German studio King Art Games. And more importantly, it's based off of a 2003 novel by Marcus Heitz, which was recently translated into English back in 2009. Heitz's book was an international bestseller, and with 700 plus pages of source material to work from, you would be optimistic that the game developers would be able to pull out what's great about the book and omit the kind of fluffy stuff that might not translate well into a video game format. Well, King Art Games only really half succeeds here. The Dwarves is a game that doesn't feel finished. It's marred with stretches of playtime that feels underdeveloped or underproduced. There's weird creative choices that add things that weren't in the novel, but then they also remove characters and scenes that were really important to the text. But before we get into the book game comparisons, I want to talk about why the Dwarves is just a frustrating game to play. It largely stems from dysfunctional systems that string the story along and the unrewarding combat. But what's funny, and maybe what's great, is that you don't really get this impression about the Dwarves from its prologue tutorial of the game. You are immediately placed in a situation where you have to defend a gate from an orcish siege, and you play as a dwarf along with other dwarven soldiers, and you immediately feel badass. There's these small doses of characterization, and there's the cinematic scope to the battle, and the idea of defending a gate from an orcish horde, I mean, that's right out of Helm's Deep, and we all know how epic that was. Epics! So, you're at one side of a long bridge, and you're staring down the horde as they swarm across, and here you're introduced to the dwarves' combat. It's real-time with pause, controlling multiple characters, up to 4. And you're managing their abilities, which are on cooldown and use these ability points, and then there's some degree of physics in battling the overwhelming odds, because oftentimes you'll have a handful of characters that are going up against dozens of foes. And the Dwarves marketing describes its combat as physics-based combat, and the tutorial does an awesome job about demonstrating what exactly this is like. A lot of your abilities are about pushing people out of the way, or knocking them over, or sending them flying. You can charge through the orcish line and push enemies off of a cliff. You can swat bad guys off the ledge with your axe and shield and into the mountain chasm below. This is great and exciting, and there's this layer of strategy that makes it more than just a real-time click and pause with abilities and stuff, because there's a physicality to the combat, and this alleviates some of the tedious micromanaging where you're clicking for an ability, seeing its area of effect, unpausing, watching it happen, pausing right after. The physicality of the combat and this physics element is what makes it really, really exciting, and the prologue does a great job of illustrating this. And then the tutorial ends. You are defeated by the mysterious evil Aelfar named Cintharus. The gate is opened, and the orcs will storm through and cover the land in a second darkness. Holy frick, this is awesome. This is a great premise, and you're immediately going, oh boy, what's next? What are we gonna do? The only problem, most of the Dwarves doesn't have this epic weight or quality to it, and even the what you're presented in the first 30 minutes is not how you spend most of the approximately 10-hour runtime. You are immediately transferred to the perspective of Tungdil, a dwarf raised in human lands, an anomaly in the realm of Girldegard for sure. It's fine, whatever. You get sent on this fetch quest that triggers Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. This is fine. This is kind of perhaps cliche, tropish fantasy. But the promise of what you just experienced makes you think that there's going to be some hope for what to come. But the problem is that that hope is delayed and delayed and delayed, and as soon as you leave the starting area of Lotnionen's vault, and you zoom out to the map overview, this is honestly where you spend probably way too much time, is staring at this pretty boring static map. The Dwarves, as I said, is about a 10-hour adventure on medium difficulty, and that's with me restarting a few times in some of the combat scenarios. And I don't know, you spend maybe 50% of your time staring out at this boring map screen. There's all these little nodes where you click and you send Tungdil and his later companions to trot along. There's little story events that pop up. You get this British woman narrating to you, you click some stuff, then you trot along, and then maybe you get into a battle scene, and so on and so forth. This is fine for the opening portion of a game because this actually mirrors a lot of Tungdil's journey in the book. There's not a clear narrative or plot in the first couple hundred pages of the Dwarves, and neither is there in the game, so I like that mirroring. So using this node hopping design doesn't detract much. The problem is that this is how a lot of the Dwarf story is told, and it just doesn't feel right for some of the later sections of the plot. Maybe it's because I got sick and tired of the same orchestral track that you hear 50 times. Maybe it's because the art is bland and boring to look at. I mean, it's nothing like watching the moving caravan in the Banner Saga. Maybe it's just too much of the same thing, but when you get into the second half of the Dwarves, there is a tighter structure to the plot, but you still click through all these nodes and you send Tungdil's little picture along. I don't know, maybe there was supposed to be more going on about why you really only have a linear path, but you can click all these different types of nodes to take a non-linear angle. Maybe the devs wanted more linear options, and linearity isn't a bad thing. Maybe we should have just scrapped this node hopping style and given some simpler page turning options or art or whatever. My ideas are probably dumb, I realized, and it's dumb to make comparisons to other games. But by the end of Tungdil's adventure, I didn't want to hear that male choir singing, I didn't want to hear those brass, or see that little Tungdil icon on those frickin' green fields ever again. When you are fortunate to leave the map screen of the Dwarves, you'll get transported to little 3D zones where you'll either engage in combat, do a bit of chit-chatting, or do some boring click exploration, or all of the above. So we have to talk about the combat. Remember when I said the first 30 minutes utilizes the great fun of the Dwarves' design, the physicality in the physics-based combat encounters? Yeah, most of the combat encounters don't really take advantage of that. You're in a flat forest or a flat field, and maybe there's like a few slopes or hills, but that doesn't really matter. A lot of the abilities of your character involve manipulating positioning, but much of Dwarves' design in areas don't make positioning super important. Movement and placement is important insofar as to make sure you don't get quadra-flanked and surrounded, and which is really how your characters will die most often. But you don't really get many satisfactory moments like kicking an orc off the bridge like you do in the first 30 minutes. And this is super disappointing. It often makes the combat stale and boring. There's also some UI problems on higher resolutions where you can't quite see how much damage you're doing or having done to you, but I guess it's not super important. You realize that the best gimmick in the game is to knock down a character to knock down a bad guy because that results in an instant kill. You realize you can train enemies out of zones of aggression far too easily. And there's this airiness to how not only the bad guys move, but how your characters move, which is really frustrating because in a matter of seconds, you can just click a character to move, but because of how everybody else is moving, they'll get pushed and moved along. And there's been multiple times where I've queued up this great sequence of abilities and AoE effects, and then, I don't know, they get bumped or something, they get moved into another party member's ability, and they get insta-killed. And then so I have to restart the mission all over again, which is super annoying. There's also not a lot of depth to the Dwarves' RPG system. You sometimes get to decide between two abilities on a level up. Your characters can only get to level 10. Maybe 3 or 4 times you'll get to choose between 2 different abilities. But you're often picking between boring and boring. So, yeah, frick, that's great. So when you're not in combat, but you're not on that silly map screen, you're walking through these zones, talking to NPCs or party members or what have you. It's not like there's a whole lot of choice or exploration in these moments either. So I often question why they're necessary, because often you just have to go talk to 3 people and nobody else. But I guess if it's between this and the map scene with dialogue overlay, I'll take this wandering these boring zones 100 times over. I think all of this, even though I sound very frustrated, I think all of this could be redeemed if the Dwarves managed to capture some of the spirit of Marcus Height's novel. Unfortunately, there's problems with the narrative too. For the majority of the Dwarves, the 4 characters you really see the most of are Tungdil, Boindel, Boindel, and Andakai. Boindel and Boindel are the stereotypical Gimli dwarf. But they're important because they're kind of the standard that you compare and contrast a lot of the other characters that you meet throughout the game. Andakai is probably the best transported character from the novel to the game. She's also probably one of the best characters in the book. So I guess there's that. For those who haven't read Heights' novel, the story of the video game, The Dwarves, can best be summarized as generic, a little cliche, and kind of stereotypical fantasy. And while some might argue that the book is also all of these things, the creators here omitted some of the most interesting conversations that the novel has. So to avoid spoilers of the story, skip ahead to the time on the screen. To those of you who have read The Dwarves and are looking to sink their teeth into the video game adaptation, and who want to be fans of this game, you're going to encounter some issues. So I should say, I'm not the biggest fan of the book, but I don't really loathe it either. But the Dwarves game, after the first quarter, does not have any shifts in perspective. And you'll know this is important, because a lot of the world building comes from the perspectives of Belindolin and the human kings and Lot Yonin. We don't get any of that here. It also makes some of the story problematic in the third act, because we never really see the firstlings rescue Belindolin from Nodon, nor is Belindolin the one who kills Bilsilbur the first time. We also never see the elves of Alandor, but in the final speech, the elves are mentioned. The second biggest problem is that we don't get Balindis' story of Lorimbur and the Thirdlings. This really should have been the biggest emphasis of the entire game, and they should have corrected the biggest problem in the book, which is we get the story of the Thirdlings when it becomes blatantly obvious that Tungdil is a Thirdling. The story of the Thirdlings and the 5 clans of the Dwarves should have been something that were in the very first act of the game. But we don't get that here. We don't get this shifting of the narrative to correct the book. In fact, we actually get a worse off situation where Lorimbur's story is never told. In the final act, when Bilsilbur tells Tungdil he is a Thirdling because he is such a great warrior, the significance is lost here. Because we never heard Balindis' story about how Lorimbur's craft, unlike all the other dwarves, is that of warfare. So there's like a narrative disconnect. It's just unfortunate because it could have been made more significant. I don't know. While King Art Games admitted some things, and I'm sure that's probably a lot more forgivable than in when you're ever adapting one form of medium to another, because you have to make some creative choices, but they also do some weird things where they add and change how the story went. And one of the big examples is how they handle Tungdil's final speech in the final moments of the game. In the book, Tungdil gives this like great rousing speech that makes him a warrior, and in many ways makes him the successor to Giselbert. But in the game, he spends his final scene with his paramour Belindis. Well, it's like that, that's not Tungdil. It's like, what the frick is going on here? They also totally inserted a new character, Geralda, which is a dwarf subject to Alfar experiments. For what reason? I don't know, Jimmy. They did this instead of playing up the significance of both Goemgar and Bavragor and the emotional impact of their demises. Why did you give more screen time to this crazy dwarf lady and to the actual characters that in the book are much more important and have a lot more gravitas? So I don't know. There you have it. The Dwarves is a game that could have been something special, but instead it's bogged down by too many uninspiring moments. The combat isn't anything special when you remove the physicality of it, but the game does remove the physicality of it for you. The plot is told and shown in a mind-numbing manner, and the adoption of the novel story into the game really doesn't quite make it. But, to those of you who are fans of Marcus Heights' Dwarvish saga, I really encourage you to at least give it a try, because maybe your opinions will be different from my own. I don't know, let me know. Pick it up on sale. To the rest, The Dwarves receives a negative score. There are better stories in role-playing games out there in the wide world, and unless you're dwarf obsessed, this game unfortunately upholds the age-old adage, the book is better.
The misty mountains cold.